When painting portraits in watercolour, you can sketch it in first, but I don't do this. You can use various devices or tracing or whatever, but this is about painting a watercolour in just watercolour, either from a photo or from a person. So you have to appreciate that the face is basically like an egg with the pointy bit down, and the hairline is going to be somewhere on this egg, and I generally start by roughing in the top bit of the egg and the hairline in very, very faint watercolour. This is usually the faintest, lightest tone in the hair and the lightest tone on the face. I then tend to roughly put the eyes in. That's the location of the eye, and you need to separate this from where the eyeball is facing. It's okay if the eyeball's facing straight towards you. If the person is looking straight at you, then the coloured bit of the eye is going to be pointing at you, but often they're not, particularly with photographs. So you can reckon the eyes on being about halfway up the egg, and you can reckon on there being a space about an eye wide between each eye. And you can measure this by holding your paintbrush up in the air and putting your thumb on it if you've got the picture or the person the right distance away from you, and you paint it in what the distance is at arm's length. It's the easiest way to do it. So you can set, if it's a digital picture, you can set the screen the right distance away so that when you hold your paintbrush up, the distance, if you hold it as an arm's length, is the same as the distance on your bit of paper. The shading is very, very important. The shading is probably more important than getting the shapes right. If you squint your eyes right up and you look at the picture, so you're looking through a tiny slit, you can see the shading much better. You don't have to be accurate at all with the shading, because providing you've used decent watercolour paper, you can remove it, you can add to it, you can wet the watercolour again and spread it out. I paint everything pretty dry, so there's no wet on wet here, but then I paint out and about in cafes, and I have been painting interiors, and now when I put the people in, I want to get a likeness, which is why I've started doing this. So I'm using the palette that I used to paint the interiors of different buildings and the exteriors. I've got used to it, so I'm probably using the wrong paints. So I have one of those Winsor & Newton boxes that holds the water and the paints, and I take the paint out of it and I squirt tubes from the actual colours that I want. So with the face tones, I'm mostly using two yellows, and that's lemon yellow, which basically looks like a lemon on the bottom right of the palette, and Naples yellow, which is very similar to the magnolia paint on the outside of buildings. And that's the top left of the palette, and second from the bottom on the left I've got a white, which is actually white gouache. So these are all Winsor & Newton artist quality paints, and I use artist quality because there's a lot more pigment in the paints, so they go a lot further when you're out and about. it saves you having to keep fill the palette up. I squirt the paint in, and then in the summer I put the thing in the sunshine to dry. In the winter I put it on the top of a radiator. Now I've got the distance for the bottom of the nose by holding the paintbrush up, or by comparing it with the distance from the forehead. The left-right distances I take as where they are straight under bits of the eyes. Now, the model's left eye in this picture looks wrong to me. The placement is slightly wrong, and the coloured bit in the eye, iris, whatever it is in the wrong place. So I'm going to have to remove it, I think. I'll try fiddling with it, but I think it's going to have to come off. And I really don't want people to think there's no way back with watercolour. You sort of can only paint dark on light, but you sort of can get it off. You can add white. You're not supposed to do these things, but then I don't see much watercolour painting that produces actual likenesses as I go round and about. I see quite a lot of drawings that are painted over. There are various odd techniques, but this type of thing I just don't see much of. So I can't look at what other people are doing and say, oh yes, there's a wet on wet technique, which is fine if you're in an artist studio, but then you'd have to find your models. And I find in a cafe you get a group of fairly fit looking people and you say to them, do you mind if I paint you? And they say, oh no problem, because you can't really take a photo. This is from a photo, and you just find a high definition photo online, and at the moment I'm trying to find fairly difficult people at fairly difficult angles. I'm also trying to find the whole body so I can have a go at figure painting. So I suppose it's quite likely that the pictures are of sex workers, so I'm not going to shove them, the actual photographs up, but I am getting a reasonable likeness, and soon I shall start doing faces of famous people. It's getting better all the time, but I find that what happens when you're learning something is easier to learn from than looking at something that someone is doing where they know what they're doing. Don't be scared of turning the paper around to get your cutting in and your curves. At the moment I'm doing a shadow which is going to pull the face out from the paper, and that's a mixture of blue and brown basically. Slosh a bit of white in if it's gone a bit too dark. It's made up of the dark bit under the hair. You can see the face coming out, becoming more three-dimensional. That left eye, the one on the right, looks really bad to me, and in a moment I'm going to scrub it out completely. It's the only way, and that I'll do by putting a lot of water and white gouache on and dabbing it off with a tissue. The nose itself looks very difficult to form, but it just starts to come out from the face as you put the shadows in. So you look, squint, and put the shadow roughly where it is, but I don't think this eye is savable. I'm trying very hard here, but in the end I think it's going to have to go. There's a lot of likeness in getting the white bits of the eye right. So if you look at the eyeball, if the white bits, those little triangles, are not the right shape, the eyes don't look like the right person. There's a lot about finding